The first thing Jason noticed when he woke up was the silence. It wasn't just the usual kind of quiet. No, it was an oppressive, almost suffocating stillness that seemed to settle over everything. He lay in bed for a moment longer than usual, staring at the ceiling. The soft hum of the world outside seemed to have disappeared. No cars passing by, no birds calling, not even the distant sound of a dog barking. Just silence. It wasn't normal. He forced himself to sit up, the bed creaking under his weight. Everything felt wrong. He rubbed his eyes as if that would somehow clear the fog in his mind. Jason was a 16-year-old boy, average in almost every way. Brown hair, messy as usual, dark eyes that carried a quiet kind of sadness, and a face that was forgettable in the crowd. He was the sort of kid no one would notice unless they tried, often keeping to himself, tucked away in the corners of his school hallways or lost in the pages of his books. Jason wasn't the popular type, but he wasn't a loner either. He had his small group of friends, his mother whom he adored, and a fairly routine life in the suburban town of Rosedale. He had no reason to believe that his existence was anything other than normal. There was nothing special about him, and that suited him just fine. But today was different. He swung his legs off the side of the bed and stood up, his feet hitting the cool wooden floor. The house felt strangely unfamiliar, the walls appearing slightly greyer than he remembered, the air colder than it should have been for a morning in late spring. Jason grabbed his phone from the nightstand, expecting to see the usual stream of notifications or a message from his mother reminding him to be ready for school. Instead, the screen was blank. "Maybe the battery's dead," he muttered, shaking it a little before pressing the power button. Nothing. "Okay, that's odd," Jason said to himself, his voice wavering slightly as a strange feeling of unease began to creep into his chest. He tried to shake it off, but the quiet only seemed to deepen around him. He walked out into the hallway and towards the kitchen. The house was still, as if everyone had simply forgotten to wake up. No sounds of footsteps or the clink of dishes. He passed his mother's room, and instinctively he reached out to knock, but when he pushed the door open, the room was empty. "Mom," he called out, the word feeling strange even as it left his mouth. The room was tidy, the bed neatly made as if she hadn't even been there. Jason stepped back, confusion growing in his chest. He turned and walked downstairs, hoping for some sign that this was all just some weird, temporary glitch in reality. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, something else caught his eye. On the wall, where there used to be a family photo of him, his mother, and a few close friends, now there was nothing. Just an empty frame. No faces, no smiles, no memories. Jason's heart began to race. This was getting worse. This wasn't just an empty house. He ran to the front door and swung it open. The quiet of the house spilled out into the street. There was no noise. No people walking by. No children playing. No cars driving past. The neighborhood was still, lifeless. He stepped outside and his breath caught in his throat as he looked around. It was as though the world had been frozen in time. The familiar streets of Rosedale were empty. The park near the corner, where kids usually gathered after school, was devoid of movement. The houses across the street, the ones he'd grown up with, were eerily silent. Jason took a few steps forward, his heart pounding now. "Hello?" he shouted, his voice cracking. There was no response, no echo, just the oppressive stillness. "Anyone?" A sense of panic gripped him as he began to walk down the street, his footsteps sounding too loud, too intrusive against the silence. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. What is going on? Where is everyone? He checked his watch. 10:32 a.m. Nothing unusual, just an ordinary day that had turned into something wrong. Something he couldn't explain. He walked faster, reaching the local corner store, but the door was locked. There was no sign of life anywhere, no one working behind the counter, no one walking around. Jason felt as though he were the only person left in the world. Okay, calm down. Maybe something happened. Maybe I'm dreaming, he muttered to himself, trying to find a rational explanation. But no matter how hard he tried to make sense of it, the cold grip of fear in his chest only tightened. He pulled his phone out again and tried to call his best friend, Derek. The call rang 3 times before going to voicemail. "Come on, Derek, pick up!" Jason thought desperately. But there was no answer. He tried his mother's number, but the result was the same. "Mom?" he whispered, his voice shaking now. Where are you? There was no answer. Frustrated and growing more afraid by the second, Jason ran to the library, a place he could always count on for some quiet. It was locked, the lights dimmed inside. He tried the door handle anyway, but it wouldn't budge. Jason's panic escalated as he felt the weight of the silence pressing down on him. It was as though the world had simply forgotten him, but it wasn't just the people who were gone. It was like he himself had vanished from the world. He ran back home, his mind whirling with confusion and fear. He entered his house again, looking around wildly for something, anything that would explain what was happening. But there was nothing, and that's when it hit him, an awful realization, cold and sharp. Jason was gone. No one remembered him. It wasn't just that everyone was missing. It was as if his entire existence had been erased. There were no memories of him. No sign of him. It was like he had never been there at all. How is this possible? Jason's mind raced as the implications of his realization hit him harder than any physical blow. His life had been erased. Jason sat on the edge of his bed, the weight of his realization settling heavily on his chest. He couldn't even remember how long he'd been staring at the empty walls of his room, waiting for something to change. His thoughts were spiraling. What do I do? He didn't know. The thought of being completely forgotten, erased from everyone's mind, gnawed at him like a persistent, silent scream. He ran a hand through his dishevelled hair and stood up, pacing. Maybe it's just a dream? Maybe I'm still sleeping and... He stopped mid-thought. No, this wasn't a dream. The cold air, the empty house, the eerie stillness outside. It was all too real. His legs moved on their own, carrying him downstairs again. He needed to get out of the house. Maybe if he left Rosedale, went to another town or something, anything. But the town seemed to stretch out endlessly no matter where he went. The emptiness didn't change. Jason grabbed his jacket and headed outside, but something stopped him at the threshold. He froze, eyes wide. Just as he reached for the door, he heard a sound, a voice, faint, but unmistakable. It was a laugh. Jason's heart leaped into his throat. He turned and ran towards the source of the noise, hoping, desperate for some sign that he wasn't completely alone. He rounded the corner of the street, pushing past the old decrepit mailbox that seemed to have sat there for ages, and stopped dead in his tracks. A girl. She stood by the edge of a worn-out playground just a few blocks away from his house. She was looking up at the sky, lost in thought. Her appearance was unremarkable, yet there was something about her that made Jason's pulse quicken. It was as though she didn't belong there either. Like her presence was as much a mystery as his own. Jason stood frozen in place, staring at her. Could she be real? He wondered. Am I imagining her? Hey! Jason called out, his voice breaking through the air like a shout in the dark. His hands trembled as he approached her. Excuse me? The girl didn't seem startled, didn't flinch at his voice. She turned to face him slowly, her eyes distant, as though she had heard him for a while but had been waiting for him to catch up. Do you remember me? Jason asked, stepping closer. He didn't know why, but the question spilled out of him before he could stop it. She blinked at him, her expression unreadable. For a moment there was only silence between them, thick and heavy. Her lips parted, but no words came. She looked at him, and then, as though deciding something, she simply nodded once. Jason's heart gave a frantic thump. You do? She tilted her head, confusion crossing her face. Remember you? She repeated, her voice flat but not unkind. You don't remember me? Jason stared at her, his mind racing. What did she mean? What are you talking about? You remember me? The girl looked away, her eyes searching the empty space around her as though she was trying to find something he couldn't see. I don't know how, but... She stopped herself. She seemed to be caught between two worlds, as though something was tugging at her from beyond her own understanding. Jason took a step forward, his chest tightening. Wait, what's your name? Can you tell me that? Her lips twitched as though she might smile, but her eyes darkened instead. Emily, she said softly. I think. Emily. Jason's world spun around him. Emily? He wasn't sure why, but hearing her name felt like a small, fragile thread of reality breaking free in a world that had turned to dust. Is she real? Is she a memory? You think? Jason's voice cracked. No. This is crazy. You have to remember. I was in school. We were in school together. His mind was beginning to unravel, but his desperation outweighed his fear. Tell me you remember me, please. The girl, Emily, looked at him again, but this time there was something different in her eyes. A trace of recognition, but it was fleeting and it vanished before Jason could fully grasp it. She shook her head. I don't remember anything. I remember standing here, waiting, but I don't remember you or anyone. Jason's stomach twisted in knots. What does that mean? He thought desperately. What's happening? His voice was barely above a whisper now. What do you mean? You don't remember anyone? No, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I mean, I don't remember anything before this, before today. It's all blank. She hugged her arms to herself as if trying to hold on to something, anything. But you remember me, don't you? Jason's heart sank. This isn't possible, he thought, but there was no mistaking the look in her eyes. She wasn't lying. She was just as lost as he was. Maybe even more so. How long have you been here? Jason asked, his words sharp, slicing through the still air between them. Emily glanced around as though the answer was hidden in the very streets they stood on. I don't know. It feels like forever, but not. I don't know. She shook her head again, more forcefully this time. Everything is wrong, but I know I'm not supposed to be here, standing like this, like we're both waiting for something that doesn't exist. Jason swallowed hard, his throat dry. Yeah, me too. His mind whirled. He wasn't the only one. Emily had no memory either. They were both trapped in a world that seemed to have forgotten them. Wait! Jason's voice suddenly grew louder as an idea hit him like a bolt of lightning. What if we're the only ones left? What if everyone else, everyone we knew, is gone? Emily's face went pale. No, that can't be. She trailed off, her voice falling into a stunned silence. Jason watched her, his own fear turning to resolve. I don't know what's going on, but we're not alone. I know it. You and me, we're still here. And I don't care if it doesn't make sense. We can't just give up. We have to find out what happened. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Emily nodded, her expression hardening with something like determination. Okay, she whispered. Let's find out together. And with that, the two of them set off into the unknown, knowing only that whatever came next, they would face it together. Whatever had erased their pasts, their memories, and their lives had to be confronted. And maybe, just maybe, they'd find a way to bring their world back. Or, at the very least, remember it. The streets of Rosedale were still, but Jason's mind was racing. He and Emily had been walking for what seemed like hours, trying to find someone, anyone, who could explain the unexplainable. The further they ventured from his house, the more the emptiness pressed in on them. Jason's sense of time was beginning to warp. Had it been hours? Days? It felt as though the sun hadn't moved at all. Where is everyone? Emily's voice was quiet, but there was an edge of panic in it now, something raw and real. This can't just be some dream. Something's wrong, Jason. Something is wrong with the whole town. Jason didn't know how to reassure her. The fear in her voice mirrored his own. They had tried every street, every alley, and every house. Nothing. No one. The town felt abandoned, suspended in some kind of frozen limbo. The world was holding its breath. We'll figure this out, Jason said, but his words felt hollow. His mind was a jumbled mess. It was hard to stay focused when every step he took felt like it was further from reality. We just need to find someone else. Maybe there's someone in another town. Emily nodded, but Jason could tell she wasn't convinced. Neither of them were. The sun was dipping lower in the sky when they reached the edge of town. The streets ended at a dense, dark forest that seemed to stretch on endlessly. The trees stood tall and twisted, their branches like dark fingers reaching into the sky. There was an unnatural stillness about it. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of earth and something more, something unplaceable. We're not going in there, Emily said firmly, taking a step back as her eyes scanned the forest nervously. Jason looked at her, then back at the looming trees. He could feel the tension building in his chest. There was something unsettling about the forest, something that made his skin crawl. But what choice did they have? The rest of the town was empty. There had to be someone, something, somewhere. We have to, Jason insisted, his voice a little more desperate than he intended. We can't just stand here. We have to know what's going on. Emily hesitated, her face pale, but after a moment she nodded. "All right, but if anything happens, I'm blaming you," she added, trying to make light of the situation, though Jason could hear the tremor in her words. They stepped into the forest, and immediately the temperature seemed to drop. The trees blocked out most of the sunlight, casting long shadows across the ground. It was darker here, colder. The silence felt even heavier than it had in the empty town. The deeper they went, the more isolated they became, as if the forest was swallowing them whole. Jason felt a sense of urgency creeping in. He needed to find answers. The weight of everything that had happened, of the unknowns, was suffocating him. He had to push forward, but something wasn't right. "Jason," Emily whispered, her voice strained. "Do you hear that?" Jason paused, his breath shallow. A soft rustling, barely audible, seemed to come from somewhere ahead of them. The wind? No, it didn't sound like the wind. It sounded like movement, like something or someone was out there. Before he could respond, the rustling grew louder, closer. Emily's eyes widened with fear. "What is that?" Jason grabbed her arm, pulling her behind a thick tree trunk, hiding them from whatever was coming. His heart raced as the sounds drew nearer. Whatever it wasn't human. From between the trees, a figure emerged. It was tall, too tall. Its body was a twisted silhouette, barely more than a shadow, but the shape of it was unmistakable. It walked on two legs, but its posture was wrong. There was something unnatural in its gait, like it was struggling to move. The figure stopped in the clearing ahead, its head swiveling side to side, scanning the area. Jason held his breath, hoping it wouldn't see them. He had no idea what this thing was, but whatever it wasn't good. A sudden, sharp snap of a twig underfoot made Jason flinch, and Emily gasped. The figure whipped its head in their direction, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Emily yanked Jason backward, pulling him further into the underbrush. "Go!" she hissed. "Run!" They didn't need to be told twice. Jason's legs moved on their own, carrying him faster than he ever thought possible, weaving between the trees as Emily kept pace beside him. Behind them, the sound of the creature's heavy footsteps echoed, getting louder with each passing second. But they didn't look back. They couldn't. Jason's breath came in short gasps, his legs burning from the effort. His heart pounded in his chest, threatening to burst out of his ribcage. They pushed through the forest for what felt like an eternity, the sounds of pursuit never letting up. Every time Jason thought they might have lost it, the creature's footsteps would grow louder again, closer. Finally, just as Jason thought he couldn't run anymore, they broke free of the trees and into a small clearing. Ahead, he saw the edge of town, the streets just barely visible in the dimming light. "We have to," Jason started to speak, but the words died in his throat as he heard the growl. It wasn't just the one creature anymore. There were more of them. Multiple pairs of glowing eyes gleamed in the darkness, watching them, closing in. "We're trapped," Emily whispered, her voice shaky, her hands clenched into fists. "There's no way out!" Jason's mind raced, his thoughts scattered. They couldn't fight these things off. They didn't even know what they were, but they couldn't just stand there and wait to be caught. They had to act. Now. "We need to run for it, across the street, to the old church! It's our only chance!" Jason shouted, already taking off in the direction of the building. He didn't wait to see if Emily was following. He couldn't. There was no time to second-guess himself. They ran as fast as they could, dodging through the darkening streets. But the creatures were faster. One of them lunged from the shadows, its claws scraping across Jason's jacket. He barely managed to dodge it, but the fear coursing through him made him move faster, instinct driving him. The church loomed ahead, its doors just within reach. They weren't far, just a few more steps. But Jason could hear the snarls growing louder, the sound of their enemies closing in on them, drawing nearer with every heartbeat. With one last burst of speed, Jason threw open the church doors and slammed them shut behind him. Emily was right behind him, panting hard, her face pale with fear. They both pressed their backs against the door, trying to steady their breathing. "Do you think we're safe?" Emily whispered, her eyes wide with terror. Jason could only shake his head, not sure himself. "I don't know," he said, his voice hoarse. "But we can't stop here. We need to find out what's really going on." And they both knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. Whatever lay ahead, whatever these creatures were, they had to face it. together. The air inside the old church was thick with tension. Jason's heart pounded in his chest, his breath ragged as he pressed his back against the heavy doors. Every nerve in his body screamed for him to keep running, to keep moving. But there was nowhere to go. Emily stood beside him, her eyes wide, her face pale with fear. She was trembling, but she was trying to hold it together. Her lips moved as if to speak, but nothing came out. The only sound was the thudding of their hearts in the silence, drowning out the growls and snarls from the other side of the church doors. Jason could hear them, pacing back and forth, their claws scraping against the stone, their breath hot and heavy. They were waiting. They were toying with them. Jason's stomach churned as the truth settled in. They weren't just out for blood. They wanted them to be afraid, to feel the weight of the unknown pressing down on them. But he wasn't going to break. Not yet. We have to find a way out, Jason whispered to Emily, his voice tight with the fear he was trying to keep under control. I know, Emily replied, her voice cracking. But how? They're everywhere. There's no way to escape. Jason's mind raced, trying to think of something, anything. There had to be a way out. But he knew deep down that they were trapped. This church, this sanctuary, had become their prison. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the church. The doors buckled, groaning under the force of something slamming into them from the other side. Jason's body tensed, instinctively pulling Emily closer, trying to shield her from whatever was about to break through. Another crash. The doors were cracking, splintering at the seams. He could hear the creature's snarls growing louder. They were closing in. Jason's eyes darted around the church. He needed a plan, quick. The only thing that stood between them and the monsters outside were the heavy wooden pews. They could push them against the door, try to barricade it, but that wasn't enough. The creatures would break through eventually. His gaze landed on the stained glass windows. They were high up, too high to reach unless... What if we climb? Jason murmured, more to himself than Emily. Emily turned to him, confused. Climb? Jason, are you out of your mind? The windows are too high. We'll never... But Jason wasn't listening. He was already moving, running toward the nearest pew. He shoved it aside with all the strength he had left, then grabbed another one, dragging it toward the windows. Emily hesitated, but then she followed him, her face determined. We have to do it, Jason said, trying to keep his voice steady. There's no other choice. It's the only together. They climbed onto the pews, their legs trembling as they hoisted themselves up. Jason reached for the windowsill, his hands a slick sweat, his fingers grasping for purchase. He felt the walls around him close in as the sounds from outside grew louder, closer. Emily was right behind him, her body stiff with fear but moving with purpose. She grabbed the ledge beside him, her breath ragged. They had made it this far. There was no turning back now. But just as Jason was about to pull himself up, a deafening crack shook the church. The doors burst open with a force that rattled the windows, and the creatures, those twisted, nightmarish figures, flooded into the room. Jason's heart stopped. They had no time. The creatures were here. The end was close. Climb, Emily! Jason shouted, his voice full of panic. Now! Emily didn't hesitate. She reached up, her fingers barely grazing the windowsill before she managed to pull herself up. Jason followed her, his muscles screaming in protest, his body straining to keep up. The creatures were almost on them, the growls filling the room, the sounds of claws scraping against the stone floor unbearable. Jason's feet found purchase on the windowsill, and in one desperate motion, he threw himself through the opening, landing hard on the cold ground outside. The air hit him like a slap. But he didn't have time to register the sensation. He scrambled to his feet and turned to help Emily. Come on, Jason shouted, his voice hoarse with urgency. Emily was right behind him, crawling through the window with a speed he hadn't expected. She landed beside him, and they both scrambled to their feet, eyes wide, looking around for any sign of escape. The creatures were still inside, but they weren't coming out. Not yet. They could hear their snarls, but the sound was muffled now, lost behind the walls of the church. For a moment, it seemed like they might have escaped, that they had a chance. But Jason knew better. He had seen what they were capable of. The creatures wouldn't stop. They'd find a way to follow them. Emily grabbed his arm. Jason, we can't outrun them forever. We need to fight back. We need to do something. Jason's mind spun. He had no plan, no weapon, but he had one thing. The church. The church had to hold some answers. They couldn't just run without knowing what these things were, why they were being hunted, and what this town's twisted secret was. "We're not running anymore," Jason said, his voice steady with newfound resolve. "We're going back. We need to figure out what's going on. We need to stop this." Emily looked at him, eyes wide with disbelief. "Are you serious? After everything we've seen, how are we supposed to stop that?" Jason's gaze hardened. "I don't know, but we're not just surviving anymore. We're going to make sure we don't disappear like everyone else." The moment stretched between them, the weight of his words settling over them like a storm. Emily nodded, determination flashing in her eyes. "Then let's go. Let's end this." Together they turned toward the church, its silhouette looming in the distance. The monsters, whatever they were still out there, waiting. But Jason knew one thing for certain. They were going to find the answers. And no matter what it took, they wouldn't go down without a fight. This was no longer about survival. It was about reclaiming their lives, taking control of their fate before they vanished into the nothingness, like everyone else. And they were ready for whatever came next. The air felt different now, thicker, almost electric with the weight of what they had done. Jason and Emily stood at the entrance of the church, its dark, imposing silhouette looming before them, the tension between the two of them palpable. The creatures inside were silent now, still lurking in the shadows, but they were no longer the same. They no longer held the power to terrify them the way they once did. Something had changed in Jason, something that had ignited a new fire in him. "We can't just run anymore," he had told Emily. And now he understood that those words weren't just about the monsters that chased them. They were about the fear that had consumed them both for so long. It was time to fight. They hadn't defeated the creatures yet, but Jason had a plan. He wasn't about to sit and wait for them to break free. The church was their battleground, but it was also their potential weapon. Inside its walls, Jason had found something, a long-forgotten secret buried under layers of dust and age, an altar hidden beneath the floorboards, and beneath it, a box that seemed to hum with power, something ancient, something that held the key to stopping the creatures. Jason's mind raced back to that moment when he'd opened the box. The strange symbols etched on its surface, the faint glow of something otherworldly emanating from within. It was as if the church itself had been waiting for him to find it, waiting for them to finally understand what was at stake. "This is it," Jason had said to Emily. "This is how we end this." Emily hadn't understood at first. How could she? They had spent days running, hiding, hoping for something, anything that would stop the relentless creatures from hunting them. But Jason had come to realize something vital. The creatures weren't just hunting them. They were part of something larger, something that had been happening for years, perhaps longer. As Emily took a deep breath, Jason's hand tightened around the edge of the box. He had no idea what it would do. But at that moment, nothing seemed more important. If they had any hope of surviving this, of putting an end to the nightmare, it was this. Together, they climbed the stairs to the altar, moving cautiously, every step filled with uncertainty. The sounds of the creature's growls still echoed through the walls, but Jason had a strange sense of calm as he walked forward. Maybe it was the box. Maybe it was the realization that the fate of everyone they loved, and their own lives, rested in their hands now. Jason reached out, his fingers brushing the edge of the box. It pulsed with energy, a strange warmth that spread through his skin. He felt a rush of power, an ancient force that seemed to recognize him. The symbols on the box flared briefly, glowing bright blue. "Now what?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Her eyes were wide, filled with a mix of hope and fear. Jason swallowed hard. "We release it." He took a deep breath and opened the box. A burst of light filled the church, so blinding that it made them both stagger back. For a split second, Jason feared they had made a mistake. Had they unleashed something worse? But the light did not hurt them. It swirled, filling the room with an almost melodic hum, like the sound of a distant wind. As the light began to fade, a presence filled the air, a presence so ancient, so powerful it made the hairs on the back of Jason's neck stand on end. "Are you sure about this?" Emily asked, her voice shaking. But she was not afraid of him anymore. She had seen the change in Jason, had felt the same surge of energy. He had brought them here. He'd given them hope. Jason nodded, his gaze steady. We don't have a choice. The creatures, they were never just monsters. They were a part of something, something that was waiting to be activated. And now it's time to stop them. Suddenly, a powerful force slammed into the church doors. The creatures, feral, desperate, and enraged, had broken through the barricade. They rushed toward them, but as they did, something shifted. The light from the box surged through the church, seeping into the walls, the floor. The creatures froze mid-step, their snarls cut off as if something had seized them. Jason could feel it too, the energy coursing through his veins. The ancient force that had been dormant for so long was now alive, and it was fighting back against the creatures, holding them at bay. The room seemed to pulse with an unseen power, and Jason closed his eyes. He focused on it. The light, the power, the force of the church. He let it wash over him. He whispered words that were not his own, words that came to him from deep within, as if the church itself was speaking through him. And then, with one final surge, the creatures howled and disintegrated into ash. They crumbled, their forms vanishing into the air, leaving only the faintest scent of burning flesh behind. Jason collapsed to his knees, the light from the box flickering and dying down to nothing. Emily knelt beside him, her face pale but filled with awe. They were safe. It was over. I don't know what just happened, Emily whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief. Are they really gone? Jason nodded slowly, unable to speak. His body felt heavy, drained of all energy, but there was a sense of peace that washed over him. The church, once a symbol of fear and isolation, now felt like a place of salvation. They're gone, Jason finally said, his voice hoarse. We did it. The silence that followed was profound, almost deafening. Outside, the world seemed still, as if holding its breath. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Jason felt like they had won. The world would remember them. They had stopped the darkness from consuming them, from erasing their existence. But there was something more. As they stood together, Jason realized that this wasn't just about survival anymore. He had found something within himself, a strength, a determination that he had never known before. And Emily had been his rock through it all. Their bond had been tested, pushed to its limits, but it had come out stronger. They had faced the darkness together, and now they could move forward. You know, we still have a lot to figure out, Emily said, her voice soft, as though the weight of everything was starting to settle. Jason smiled, his heart lighter than it had been in days. We'll figure it out. Together. And for the first time in a long while, Jason felt that maybe, just maybe, the world wouldn't forget them after all. The church, once a symbol of their fear, now stood as a quiet testament to their victory. Its walls, dark and weathered, seemed to hum with a silent energy, as if the ancient power that had protected them was now forever woven into its very stones. The creatures were gone, turned to dust in the blink of an eye. Jason and Emily stood side by side, their eyes wide with disbelief and relief. It was over. They had survived. Jason looked at Emily, her face pale but filled with a mix of awe and exhaustion. He could see the tremors still running through her, her hands shaking despite the calm that had settled in the church. She had fought alongside him every step of the way, but now, with the threat extinguished, they were left with the quiet aftermath. Is it really over? Emily whispered, as though speaking too loudly would make it all come crashing back. Jason nodded slowly. His body felt like it was made of stone, heavy with the weight of everything they had been through. His heart pounded, a slow and steady beat, as if reminding him that, yes, they had made it. They had truly made it. It's over, he said, his voice hoarse but sure. The air inside the church felt cooler now, the oppressive heat of the creature's presence lifted. Jason's gaze drifted to the remnants of the box on the altar. It had burned out, the mysterious light now nothing more than a memory. He felt a pang of something. Grief, maybe. Something powerful had been released, and now there was nothing left. No more monsters to face, no more unknowns, and yet in its place there was peace. Emily stepped forward and touched the altar, her fingertips brushing against the cold stone. What happens now? Jason looked at her, his mind spinning with possibilities. The world outside had to be different now. They couldn't go back to the way things were. The creatures were gone. But what about everything else? What about the world they had left behind, the people who had forgotten them? I think... Jason hesitated, unsure of how to put the swirling thoughts in his mind into words. I think we need to leave. We've done what we came here to do, but the world is still out there. We can't stay here forever. Emily didn't respond immediately. She gazed at the door, as though imagining what lay beyond it. The desolate landscape, the world that had been ravaged by the creature's presence. But there was something more in her eyes now, something stronger than fear. "Do you think anyone remembers us?" she asked quietly, almost to herself. Jason didn't have an answer. He wasn't sure what to believe. After everything that had happened, the creatures, the power of the church, the battle they had fought, it felt like the world had shifted somehow. But whether it would remember them was another matter. Would they even matter once they left the island? Would the world welcome them back, or had they truly been erased, like ghosts forgotten by time? But then he thought of the box, the symbols, the power it had released. Maybe this was their moment. They weren't the same as before. They had fought the darkness and emerged stronger for it. "We don't need to be remembered," Jason said, more to himself than to Emily. "Not by anyone except us." Emily met his gaze, her eyes soft but resolute. "You're right." A silence fell between them, but it was a different kind of silence now, a peaceful one. The tension that had held them captive for so long was gone. They didn't need anyone's recognition to know what they had accomplished. Together, they had overcome the impossible. Jason's gaze shifted to the horizon outside, the soft light of dawn beginning to paint the sky. It was a new day, one that stretched out before them, full of uncertainty but also promise. They had no idea what awaited them in the world beyond the church, but they had each other. And that was enough. "You ready?" he asked. Emily nodded, her expression softening. She seemed to understand, perhaps more than Jason did, that this was their new beginning. Their fight had ended, but their journey was just beginning. They didn't need to dwell on the past, on the monsters, or the terror they had faced. They needed to focus on what came next. Together, they stepped toward the door. As they crossed the threshold, the world outside greeted them with the fresh scent of morning air. The church, now behind them, felt like a distant memory, a place they could leave behind. The world stretched out before them, full of endless possibilities. They didn't know what the future would hold, but they knew they were no longer running. Jason turned to Emily, a smile tugging at his lips. She returned it, the weight of the last days lifting from her shoulders. They had both changed. He had seen it in the way Emily had fought, in the way she had trusted him, and he, too, had learned to trust. Trust in her. Trust in themselves. "We'll figure it out," Jason said, his voice steady, filled with a newfound certainty. Emily smiled again, her eyes sparkling with something Jason hadn't seen before. "Hope." "Yeah," she replied softly. "We will." And with that, they walked into the world hand in hand, ready to face whatever challenges came next. The creatures were gone. The darkness was behind them. It was time to move forward. The island was a memory now, a memory of fear and survival, but also of growth, of learning the strength within them both. The world might have forgotten them, but it didn't matter. They had not forgotten each other. Together, they would rebuild. Together, they would move forward into the unknown. And that was enough.